a todos y a todas. Bienvenidos a esta quinta sesión plenaria que tiene por título La Universidad del siglo XXI, Alma Mater para la Sociedad. Intentamos, pues, ver ideas, modelos para adaptar el alma mater universitaria a el nuevo siglo y el nuevo milenio. Es un placer, en primera instancia, tener la ponencia de la señora Eva Egron. Eva Egron fue educada en la República Checa, en Canadá y en Francia. Estudió literatura francesa, ciencias políticas y economía política internacional. Durante casi 20 años, aunque es muy joven, se desempeñó en diversos cargos directivos en la Asociación de Universidades y Colegios de Canadá, antes de convertirse en la Secretaria General de la Asociación Internacional de Universidades en el año 2002, la UAI o IAU, dependiendo de si es en español o es en inglés. Como Secretaria General de la AUI, una asociación mundial independiente de universidades y asociaciones de instituciones de educación superior, con sede en la UNESCO en París y con una larga experiencia en la cooperación internacional en este ámbito, Eva Egron se encarga de muchas de las cuestiones más apremiantes en los actuales debates, tales como la internacionalización, la enseñanza superior transfronteriza, la educación superior para el desarrollo sostenible, el acceso equitativo a la educación superior, entre otros. Bajo su liderazgo, la AIU lanzó encuestas mundiales, periódicas y sistémicas sobre la internacionalización y ha creado un programa de subvenciones para el desarrollo profesional norte-sur y la colaboración sur-sur. Es pues un verdadero placer tener con nosotros a Eva Egron-Polak.
Buenos días. Discúlpeme, yo hablo no español, yo hablo en inglés. So I would first of all like to thank the translator for the job he's been doing for the past 2 days, making us Anglophones understand, and hopefully making you, my colleagues from Latin America, understand me. It is a true pleasure and an honor for me to join the speakers during this conference and to speak on behalf of the International Association of Universities about the contribution of networks of universities in the promotion of values and social engagement in and by higher education institutions. This conference, organized by the UTPL and the IOHE here in Loja, is a wonderful, almost a follow-up conference to the one that IAU held in June last year in Lithuania on the topics of ethics and values in the era of globalization. I congratulate IOHE and thank them and UTPL for inviting IAU to contribute into this discussion. The outline of my presentation is fairly straightforward. I will spend a couple of seconds introducing you to IAU and to the topic that we're discussing. I'll try to add some of the context setting to what we have already heard and list some of the reasons why universities must engage in social activities or be socially responsible. I'll try and define the concepts that we've been talking about, and then I will turn to some examples of how IAU contributes to the discussion. In my concluding remarks, I will make a couple of suggestions for us to move forward, and then I will invite you to some of our next events. So first of all, IAU. These topics are not foreign to IAU. As an association of more than 650 universities and university associations from around the world, IAU has been tackling issues of social engagement and responsibility since its creation. IAU was created at the same time as UNESCO, and although today we are a membership organization, completely membership-driven and independent, we continue to hold the values and the ethos of UNESCO close to the core of our work. It is quite fitting, I think, for me to address how networks address social engagement and promote values, since, in a certain way, the very act of establishing IAU more than 60 years ago, its constitution, in fact, anchors the association in a set of principles and values that integrate social responsibility fully into the definition of higher education. The founders of IAU began their constitution in the following words: conscious of their high responsibility as guardians of intellectual life, conscious of their obligation as social institutions to promote, through teaching and research, the principles of freedom and justice, of human dignity and solidarity, and to develop mutually material and moral aid at the international level. So you can see that IAU was founded in certain ways to promote social responsibility at the global level. When discussing the theme of values and social engagement, it is possible to assume several perspectives. On the one hand, we can examine how universities promote certain values in society and serve the community in economic, social, and cultural terms. Thus, we can adopt a mainly outward-looking perspective. Alternatively, we can also choose to look inward and see how institutions, universities, operate, and whether and how certain values and the commitment to social engagement translates into institutional behavior and academic and scientific as well as administrative terms. In the context of globalization and internationalization, it seems to me these two perspectives, inward and outward oriented, become almost impossible to differentiate or disassociate. They're also made ever more important and complex. Furthermore, both social engagement and the values that underpin such engagement needs to be viewed through a lens which is a long-range lens, allowing for a much broader vision today, and allows us to understand and appreciate different value systems. Such a broader horizon forces us to consider to what extent the values, our values, which are necessarily based on a specific cultural tradition and context, how these can fit within a set of universally accepted values and principles, and to realize where they may clash with others' beliefs and why. It seems to me that only this opening and confrontation with what is different, that this confrontation implies, brings about an acceptance and, more importantly, an appreciation of others' points of view, and thus leads us to learn from one another. Second, the notion of social engagement, or what we often call social responsibility, must also include the wider world. Though acting locally and being locally relevant is essential, it is no longer sufficient for any university if it is to offer a preparation of quality for future citizens and hopefully for future leaders. The social responsibility that needs to be promoted by universities must therefore extend to the international sphere in both theory and practice. Since the consequences of most events and most measures that we take have major ripple effects far and wide. So our curriculum, our research, and our outreach and community services need to fully recognize this. And most of IAU work illustrates this commitment in fairly concrete terms still today. For this reason, I will end my presentation with a few examples of the kinds of activities that IAU has undertaken to highlight and to promote key dimensions of universities' responsibility to act as vehicles transmitting values and instilling in their students and faculty and staff a sense of social engagement, and how we promote fair and responsible international cooperation. But let me also start by setting the context and asking ourselves why the universities are such critical actors in this field, and why, even if not new, this discussion that we're having here remains timely and important. We live in a world of unprecedented opportunities, but also a world with huge gaps and inequality. Despite the progress made, these gaps persist, and at times they grow. In today's world, the difference between developing and developed nations, between rich and poor people within nations, between those individuals who are included in society and those who are excluded or marginalized, is very often based on their access to education and their capacity to flourish in a knowledge society. And while knowledge is quite often considered as a global public good, even by economists, the provision of higher education, and most especially the credentials, the degrees granted, the discoveries made which are patented, and the results of knowledge that is applied and turned into new goods and services are far more firmly in the domain of the private good, with restricted and limited access quite often. To the extent that this is the case, the inequalities and gaps will grow, and the social responsibility of universities to prevent this from happening, and on the contrary, to contribute to narrowing these gaps, will also grow. Globalization, which is changing all transactions and all human interactions, is also creating an emerging global higher education landscape, which is characterized by its unevenness and by competition for everything. Competition for the best students, the best researchers, the best faculty members. The rankings, which we all know about, have created a global reputation race and a kind of survival of the fittest mentality, which is increasingly coloring all the choices universities are making when they set their development strategies, and even when they determine who to partner with internationally or at home. These globalizing forces are often in opposition or in contrast with the commitment to solidarity and a social inclusion agenda. As was remarked yesterday, social responsibility is often not a priority. We can also note many other trends, and we spoke about them already yesterday. A fairly steep decrease in public funding in some parts of the world, which is resulting in a push towards increased privatization, even of public institutions. The context is also characterized by high demand for access to higher education, especially in developing and emerging nations, where it is often the single most important gateway for a better life, but where supply of higher education or the capacity of the system to accept more students remains fairly weak. Those spectacular and strategic investments in several emerging economies have shown how quickly capacity can be built. We also witness incredible and pervasive technological innovations that allow a continuous expansion and diversification in the modes of delivery of education and ways to facilitate access to educational resources and research collaboration. So for many, IT offers the most likely solution to this supply and demand disequilibrium. In short, we live in a higher education era of tremendous opportunity, but also some major risks. Risks of commercialization and commodification of higher education. Risk of increased rather than decreased brain drain. Dangers of academic malpractice and fraud, including a growing number of cases of plagiarism, which is made so easy by technology. More degree mills or fraudulent or simply low-quality education providers. There's also a risk of decreased focus on widening participation to those in society who are now underrepresented in our higher education institutions. Ethnic minorities, recent immigrants, or simply students or people from low socioeconomic parts of society. As well, high selectivity of higher education institutions is today a plus if we want to position our institutions in the rankings. So another reason why reaching out to those underrepresented is much more a risky action today than in the past. All of these potential and real risks require vigilance and proactive efforts in order to safeguard the fundamental values of free inquiry, justice, equity, critical and unorthodox thinking, and solidarity. These trends demand that we make a special effort to promote such values within the university and in its interaction with society. So before I turn to the examples of how IAU has been working in this area, let me just talk for a second about the meaning of social engagement, since it is by no means clear or self-evident that there is a single way to understand this concept. In fact, for IAU, the notion of social responsibility is more frequently what we talk about. Others talk about community engagement. Yesterday we talked about social work. And many in Europe particularly are talking about the third mission. Recently, the following definition of social responsibility or social engagement was offered for consideration. It is a university's responsibility to preach and practice a set of principles and values through its core functions of teaching, research, community engagement, and institutional management. In this definition, what I like particularly, it is both inward-looking and outward-looking. It needs to permeate the possibilities and the practices of the university. And it is not an activity that can be left on the side, but rather is an integral part of all institutional functions. However, I think, as did the author of this definition, that we must spell out the values that we are promoting quite clearly. And these are some of the possibilities that we could list as the key values: commitment to fairness, truth, and ethics, promotion of social equity and sustainable human development, recognition of an individual's dignity and liberty, appreciation of diversity and multiculturalism, promotion of human rights, democracy, and civic responsibility. I have added two more: honesty and transparency, because I think these need to be stressed as well today. Since the person I'm citing is a former IAU president, Professor Ghulam Mohammed Baid, with whom I worked closely for 4 years, I think these definitions and these values also demonstrate quite clearly the basis for much of IAU's work. So, let me quickly turn to our work in this area. For the most part, our efforts have taken on the form of normative policy statements. We have, as well as, I should say, our contribution to the elaboration of other declarations, such as the 1998 and 2009 UNESCO World Conference declarations. In each case, 1998 and 2009, I had the privilege of being a member of the drafting committee that prepared those documents that were cited so eloquently yesterday. IAU, as an organization of universities, has also elaborated several declarations, and what they all have in common is the fact that they've been drafted by groups of experts and university leaders from a widely different set of contexts, from developing and industrialized nations, from institutions in the Islamic and Arab world, from the Anglo-Saxon, Francophone, or Latin tradition, from private and public universities. The IAU policy statements represent the association's commitments to key principles in higher education, and yet they're based on a consensus built among a tremendously rich variety of perspectives. For this reason, if for no other, these documents have some weight. I believe IAU was the first university association to adopt a statement on sustainable development and the responsibilities that universities have to, and I quote, to utilize the resources of the university to encourage a better understanding on the part of governments and the public at large of the interrelated physical, biological, and social dangers the planet Earth facing the planet Earth, and to recognize the significant interdependence and international dimension of sustainable development. This statement was adopted in Kyoto, Japan, as early as 1993. Since then, IAU has maintained one of the most comprehensive websites in higher education and sustainable development, where you can find all kinds of resources to use in your reflections and research. We're also working in collaboration with UNESCO, with UNEP, with the UNU, and promoting the UN Decade for Sustainable Development in Education. Another example of policy statements that demonstrate the association's commitment to global social responsibility has to do with cross-border education, and more broadly with internationalization. IAU regularly conducts research on internationalization and publishes a global report. We've published 3 such reports on how this process of internationalization is transforming higher education. IAU's Global Vantage Point provides a tremendous opportunity as well as a huge responsibility to track and point out how this process may, and in fact does, impact differently on different regions of the world. Our policy statements are designed to urge institutions to act ethically and responsibly when going global. IAU in this regard calls for, and I quote again from our first policy statement, which was elaborated in 1998 in time for the World Conference, preparing future leaders and citizens for a highly interdependent world requires a higher education system where internationalization promotes cultural diversity and fosters intercultural understanding, respect, and tolerance among people. Such internationalization contributes to build more than economically competitive and politically powerful regional blocs. It represents a commitment to international solidarity, human security, and helps to build a climate of global peace. In 2004, we elaborated, in collaboration with 3 other associations, a second policy statement, which was a far more blunt warning about the negative impacts or the negative potential of internationalization. This statement has actually been endorsed by close to 30 associations, including the IOHE, and it calls for a higher education across borders to serve the goals of global equity, and warns that it should not lead to that global higher education or cross-border education would not be, or the goals of global solidarity would not be sacrificed to commercial interests, which is, I think, a major consideration. I'll try and go much faster. You will say, and I will agree with you, that statements are just words, unless they're turned into deeds. But I think, and we saw that yesterday in the signing of a new declaration, they are symbolic, and they can be powerful mechanisms to mobilize people. My suggestion, though, is that rather than adding new statements and new declarations, we need to do that with care. Instead, we need to focus on disseminating the declarations that exist and making certain that we act upon them. I think in the opening session, the rector of UTPL said, "Are we credible?" And I think what he was asking is, are we credible if we do not deliver on the statements that we make? For that reason, just a couple of weeks ago in India, at a meeting of associations of universities where IOHE was represented, we agreed to once again disseminate our internationalization statements and start making certain that institutions abide by the principles they promote. But at the same time, and as a follow-up to our conference on ethics and values that was held in Vilnius in 2010, we are embarking on a drafting process for some guidelines for an institutional code of ethics in higher education. I think this work is based on the belief that institutions of higher education must set the example. We cannot just have declarations, we also have to look at ourselves. And the code of ethics that we're going to be recommending will have to have monitoring mechanisms and a capacity to sanction malpractice. And here again, IAU is working in collaboration with the Magna Carta Observatory in Bologna, but also we have the IOHE past president as a member of our working group drafting this document. I can go through another couple of examples, but since I don't have the time, I'm going to skip to my concluding remarks and ask the questions, what can we do? And in fact, what must we do? As I said earlier, I think we need to make certain that when we sign declarations, we carry through on the recommendations. We must revisit from time to time the declarations we sign, see whether they're still valid, update them, but most importantly, work on implementing them. Yesterday, someone said we need to make social engagement a higher priority. I think one of the key issues for us will be how to make a university's performance on social responsibility become something that institutions are proud of and want to be compared on against others. Rankings compare research competitiveness. They compare on how many Nobel Prize winners have graduated. How many rankings do we know about that compare on the social responsibility of universities? We need to make certain that that dimension becomes part of the existing rankings, or we need to make certain that new rankings, as many as possible, take that into consideration. And as a final suggestion, and just one possibility, I thought that we could look at how institutions set goals for the most important part of the university, the students. To what extent do we set goals for learning outcomes for our students? I looked around and found this example from the American Association of Universities and Colleges, which have, through a project called Core Commitments, identified 5 dimensions of learning goals that they wish to set for their students. And here they are. They want all of their students to strive for excellence. They want to cultivate each student their personal and academic integrity. They want to contribute. They want their students to learn how to contribute to a larger community, both local and international, to take seriously the perspectives of others, and develop competence in ethical and moral reasoning and action. These are simple, general, but maybe each institution can draw up their own, that suit their own context, their own mission, and their own desires, but going in this direction. Finally, let me just conclude by inviting all of you to 2 upcoming IAU events. One in Kenya, Nairobi, Kenya, in November 2011, which will look at how universities set strategy for equity and access and success in higher education. And the second one, a general conference of IAU, where we will look at the role and responsibility of higher education in the global agenda. And this will be hosted by the institution that which our chair is from, the University, Inter-American University in Puerto Rico, in November 2012. We hope that it is at this meeting that the guidelines for a code of ethics will be adopted by the General Conference, and we also hope at this time that our new president, whose name I will not mention, will be elected at that time. Thank you very much. More information about IAU and all of our statements are available on our website in English or French. Thank you.
Agradecemos a Eva Egron su presentación, donde se destaca primero la importancia de que a nivel internacional y a nivel nacional continuemos con esta serie de congresos y actividades donde examinemos los temas de la ética y valores y responsabilidad social en nuestras universidades. También destacó el rol de la IAU y de la UNESCO en plasmar en unos documentos ese consenso mundial sobre estos temas, tomando en cuenta las diferencias culturales y regionales, y además la necesidad de que no solamente nos quedemos en declaraciones, sino que se divulguen los documentos, las declaraciones se implanten y todos demos seguimiento a esas declaraciones. Y destaca finalmente las guías que la AUI está desarrollando, guías sobre códigos de éticas en las universidades, que no solamente van a incluir a los profesores, a los investigadores, sino a toda la comunidad universitaria. Y finalmente destacó la importancia de tener y de incluir y pensar en los alumnos y que ellos participen en este proceso. Muchas gracias.